All right, picture this for a second. It's the pitch black, early morning hours of February 22nd, 2026. We're in Tapapa, which is this really picturesque, small mountain tourist town in Mexico. Cobblestone streets, incredibly quiet forests. But moving completely silently through the woods just outside of town is a massive coordinated coalition of Mexican special forces, the National Guard, and the Army. And their target? Literally the most wanted drug lord in the world, who happens to be hiding out in a secluded cabin. So let's jump right into this explainer and see exactly how this single, wildly violent morning ended up igniting a geopolitical shockwave. But before we really unpack the global crisis that followed that raid, we absolutely have to understand the brutal philosophy that governed this man's entire life. And frankly, it governed this raid, too. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. Basically, take the bribe or take a bullet. This totally unforgiving rule basically guaranteed a fiery shootout that morning. Security forces ultimately killed 4 cartel members, and the kingpin himself, a man known as El Mencho, was severely wounded after fleeing into the woods. He was captured, but he actually ended up dying en route to Mexico City. Section 1. The Fall of El Mencho. To really comprehend the terrifying aftermath of this military operation, we've got to look at the sheer irony of his rise to power. Born into absolute poverty back in 1966 in Michoacan, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes dropped out of school in the 5th grade just to guard marijuana fields. Fast forward to 1992, he gets arrested in California for dealing heroin and is deported back to Mexico. But here is the crazy part. A convicted, deported drug dealer returns to Mexico and actually becomes a police officer. No joke. It was right there, inside the police force, that he learned the deep inner workings of state corruption. He learned exactly who could be bought and for how much. And he took that exact blueprint and used it to form the CJNG cartel in 2010. Section 2. The fentanyl and meth empire. Now, one guy alone doesn't just wake up and shake the foundations of multiple nations, right? It takes capital, serious capital. Traditionally, cartels relied heavily on organic drugs, so things like cocaine and heroin. But that meant relying on Colombian suppliers, managing vast tracts of land, and dealing with entirely unpredictable agricultural variables like the weather. Well, El Mencho pivoted. He made a massive strategic shift towards synthetic drugs, specifically meth and fentanyl. You don't need huge fields for these. You just need a lab and precursor chemicals sourced from China. CJNG literally took total control of the port of Manzanillo in Mexico just to guarantee a streamlined single access point for all these raw materials. They basically just cut out the middleman entirely. And that brings us to the economics of this operation, which are frankly downright terrifying. 10 cents, a dime. That is literally all it costs to manufacture a single lethal fentanyl pill. We're talking about a synthetic opioid that is 50 times more powerful than heroin. Just to put that into perspective, a dosage of just 2 milligrams, imagine maybe a few grains of salt resting on your fingertip, can be completely fatal. So how exactly does 10 cents build a global empire? Well, do the math. That 10-cent pill commands a street value of $10 to $30 in the US. A cartel can invest a mere $500 into production and yield a staggering $20 million in pure profit. It's an insane return on investment. And this astronomical wealth is exactly what directly fueled the tragic loss of roughly 73,000 lives to synthetic opioid overdoses in the US in 2023 alone. With billions of dollars at their disposal, CJ&J didn't just act like your average street gang anymore. They essentially morphed into a heavily armed paramilitary force, completely capable of going toe-to-toe with the national government. For instance, in May 2015, when the military tried to capture El Mencho, cartel members literally used RPGs to shoot down a military helicopter. 9 out of the 18 soldiers on board were killed. By 2018, they were operating well over 100 meth labs. And by 2019, the DEA estimated that CJ&G supplied a full third of all the drugs entering the U.S. by air and sea. Section 3. Mexico's corrupt political machine. Okay, so this level of unprecedented military and economic power naturally forces a pretty critical question. How on earth does a cartel amass this much influence without the government just shutting them down? Well, it all comes down to a deeply entrenched political machine known as the Plaza system. You see, for decades under the PRI government, the core strategy wasn't actually to eradicate cartels, it was to manage them. The government essentially ran on extortion. Cartels paid massive, routine bribes to local mayors, police chiefs, and state governors simply to keep the violence out of the public eye. Now, sure, it limited open warfare on the streets, but it cemented organized crime deep into the very DNA of local government. And when that old one-party system finally broke down, successive presidents tried radically different approaches to try and fix this crisis. In 2006, President Calderon launched a highly militarized war on drugs, actively deploying troops into the streets. But honestly, taking out top kingpins just ended up fracturing the megacartels into dozens of smaller, incredibly violent splinter gangs. Then, jumping to 2018, President AMLO introduced a completely opposite policy called Hugs Not Bullets. This was a social policy aimed at tackling the root poverty that drives cartel recruitment in the first place. But, as the source material points out quite clearly, both of these vastly different political strategies, from total militarization all the way to social welfare, ultimately failed to contain the Hydra-like nature of the cartel threat. Section 4. How America Fueled the Crisis. Now, to lay the blame entirely on Mexico would honestly be missing half the story. The United States isn't just a victim in all of this. Historically speaking, it's been a major architect of the crisis through a long chain of institutional missteps. Back in the 1980s, the CIA was actually training Contra rebels right on properties owned by Mexican drug lords. Then in 1994, NAFTA opened up the borders to roughly 12,000 trucks every single day, which made thorough drug inspections physically impossible. Around that same time, heavily subsidized U.S. corn flooded the Mexican market, which ended up displacing an estimated 2 million Mexican farmers. And a lot of those displaced farmers became desperate enough to work as foot soldiers for the cartels. Oh, and in the 2000s, U.S. agencies running Operation Fast and Furious purposely allowed over 2,000 weapons to cross the border. The goal was to track them, but they ended up losing them entirely to the cartels. And sadly, those lost weapons are just a tiny drop in the ocean. Between 2014 and 2018, an astonishing 70% of all firearms recovered at crime scenes in Mexico were traced directly back to the United States. 70%! With over 6,700 gun dealers situated right along the border region, there is just a steady, relentless river of American iron flowing south while the synthetic drugs flow north. Section 5. A Shared Geopolitical Nightmare. So, this massive, tangled web of shared responsibility brings us right back to the present day, February 2026, and the absolute chaos that followed El Mencho's death. The cartel's response to the raid was immediate, and it was terrifying. A senior CJNG leader placed a bounty of 2,000 Mexican pesos, which is about $100, on the head of every single Mexican soldier. Just let that sink in for a second. This is pure, textbook narco-terrorism. You have an organized crime group actively placing bounties on their own nation's military personnel. And the domestic retaliation completely paralyzed the nation. Across 20 different states, cartel gunmen set vehicles on fire and completely shut down major highways. Guadalajara, which is Mexico's second-largest city, effectively became a ghost town as over 250 roadblocks went up. Schools had to close, flights were canceled. Security analysts were openly comparing this to the Pablo Escobar era of the 1980s, where cartel basically declared total war on the state itself. And the international response? Incredibly aggressive. The Trump administration officially labeled the cartels foreign terrorist organizations. In a highly severe military move, the U.S. launched Operation Southern Spear, conducting 44 strikes in international waters against alleged cartel vessels. At least 150 people were killed in these maritime bombings. Now, the U.S. Defense Secretary likened the cartels to al-Qaeda in the Western Hemisphere, justifying the force. Meanwhile, human rights groups heavily criticized the bombings, pointing out that civilian fishermen were among the casualties in these strikes. And right now, the clock is absolutely ticking for the newly elected Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum. Why? Well, because in June 2026, just a few short months after this massive cartel war erupted, the FIFA World Cup is set to arrive right in cartel territory. There is immense global pressure on her administration to somehow stabilize a literally burning region before the world's largest sporting event kicks off. Which ultimately brings us to the biggest question of all. We've seen the dramatic capture and death of the world's most wanted drug lord, but if the massive demand for fentanyl remains high in the U.S., if that river of American guns continues to flow south, and if the root causes of corruption and poverty still pay out, can this cycle ever truly break? Does removing one single kingpin really matter when the macro-level systems of supply, demand, and corruption remain perfectly intact? Think about that for a while. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.